Thanks very much. Dobro pожаловать, товарищи. Those who get the joke, others will not. And welcome very much to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and this discussion, which we're calling Russia on the Edge. And we look forward today to hearing from our friend Ilan Berman, who's the Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council and the author most recently of Implosion, The End of Russia and What It Means for America. And also with us, Aron, resident scholar, director of Russian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Cliff May. I'm the president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And for those few of you who may be unfamiliar with us, this very, very brief introduction. FDD's mission begins with principles. It focuses on research and policy development and endeavors to achieve real progress. And those affiliated with FDD come from a range of backgrounds and may hold a range of opinions. We don't all agree on everything by any means. There are some basic principles on which we do have consensus. One is that no one should be denied basic human rights, including freedom of religion, speech, assembly. No one should be discriminated against on the basis of gender or race, creed, color, sexual orientation. Also, free and democratic nations have a right to defend themselves and actually an obligation to defend one another. And we also think that terrorism, which we define very simply, very straightforwardly as the deliberate use of violence against civilians for political purposes, is always wrong. It is never to be condoned. Now, a few points of housekeeping. I note this session is on the record. Importantly, I want to note also our building has graciously, for our safety, decided to test fire alarms today. So at some point, if you hear a beeping noise or see lights going off, don't worry too much. We're probably not under attack. Don't be alarmed if there is a real emergency. We have people who will let you know about that. I'm going to ask you to silence your phones or anything else you have on you that may go beep. And let's move on to today's topic. In his new book, as I mentioned, Implosion, The End of Russia and What It Means for America, Dr. Berman argues that contemporary Russia is plagued by chronic corruption, economic stagnation, a death spiraling birth rate, and a rapidly aging population, rampant alcoholism and drug use, capital flight, brain drain, and a growing angry Muslim population are among the other symptoms that Dr. Berman sees as irreversible, signs of irreversible and lethal decay. So let me start with this.
On that cheery note?
On that cheery note. In recent days, we've seen Russian President Vladimir Putin strutting on the world stage, eating President Obama's lunch, saving Syrian dictator Assad's bacon, figuratively speaking, of course, and of course empowering Iran in many ways. Now, we may not approve of any of this, but in this light, Russia does seem to be increasingly actually powerful, in the spotlight, dynamic. It's out there. How do you square these circles?
Well, I think that, there's that old political saw that says that when you have trouble at home, you go abroad. And, we've seen more than our fair share of that here in the United States, but I think there's a grain of truth, at least, to that, in the sense that the dynamics that you talked about, the demographic decline, the sort of the rise and radicalization of a Muslim underclass, growing strategic competition with China in the Far East, these are all long-term trends. For the moment, it looks a lot like Russia's winning, and it's winning, by the way, in comparison, right? I mean, what Putin has done in the Middle East on Syria, on Iran, is opportunistic. The Syria-Russia deal is very helpful for Assad, but it's just as helpful for Russia in terms of securing long-term Russian military access to the Eastern Mediterranean and things like that. And Putin's been able to do that because of an absence of American strategy, long-term strategy in the region. But if you look further into the future, the trend lines for Russian strength are increasingly speculative. Instead, as I argue, the domestic trend lines are going to be consumptive. They're going to begin to occupy Russia more and more as you look further into the future.
Leon, do you agree that Russia is imploding? Do you think that it's as irreversible a decline as Ilan does?
Well, it's the decline of the regime. It's the decline of the regime. Frankly, the sooner the regime declines, the sooner the regeneration of Russia begins. I think that's the only way to look at it. There is after Russia emerged from the 2008-2009 crisis, which, by the way, it was hit harder than any other top 10 nation. They lost almost 8% of its GDP in a year. It became clear, and this is a cliche, this is a stereotype if you go to Moscow, that the model based on the export of commodities, primarily gas and oil, is increasingly not working. And what I think we're seeing, and what Ilan captured here, is 9 years, so that would be 4 years after that became clear, the regime not only failed to do what is necessary, and again, by the way, it's not just Medvedev, it's not just Putin, it's everybody, every minister, and of course Kudrin is saying it all along, we need a deep institutional reform to stimulate domestic and foreign investment. And you could go, and I'm sure Ilan has it in his book, you could go through the list of where Russia stands on corruption, where Russia stands on the state presence in the competitive sectors of the economy, where it stands on the red tape, where it stands on rights, and so on and so forth, protection of investment, and so on. You need, as one of the top Russian analysts put it very recently, you need entrepreneurial energy. This is not 1930s, where incidentally, and we can talk about this, where incidentally Putin looks with increasing nostalgia. This is not the 1930s where you could build plants producing steel and tanks and tractors and measure the economic progress that way. Mm-hmm. For better or worse, nobody needs that anymore. And what you need is the entrepreneurial energy, and this is precisely what this regime not only hampers, and again, we could talk about it later, but after Putin's re-election, after his frontal assault on civil society and its leadership, essentially seemed to be determined, suicidal, I would say, to extirpate.
There's a number of things I want to get back to here, but let me dig down on one part of this, and that is, biology may not be destiny, but demographics is.
Absolutely.
And you point out in your book that the birth rate in Russia is not a replacement birth rate. And when you have fewer people in each generation, you end up with what I've called, and others have called, I think, a death spiral. In other words, you have two parents have one kid, and two parents have one kid, and these kids ones. Pretty soon you end up with a fast diminishing population. Now that can mean one of two things. You can end up with a country that has half the population and the quarter of the population in a very big area, unless you have another population that's rising. And that other population, as you point out, is a Muslim population in Russia. And I think what you suggest, I'm not sure you say it quite this way in the book, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that most of this population, they think of themselves not as Russian Muslims, but as Muslims in Russia, which is very different. They're not integrated into Russian culture and society in any way. It's not like in the U.S. where people come from all over the world, and if in a generation they think of themselves as Joe America, wherever they're from, whatever their religion is. One hopes that's the concept, at least. In Russia, we don't have that. Young Muslims in Russia, in Dagestan, and Chechnya, and even if they're in Moscow, probably are not reading Pushkin and being inspired by him.
Right, and that's not necessarily uniform. So let's unpack a couple things.
Okay.
First of all, the demographic rate. Putin, in a campaign speech that he gave in December of 2012, talked about demographics and about how he needs to run a national campaign of renewal. And he made the projection. I make lots of projections in the book, but he actually made the projection that Russia's population, which is 142.9 million as of the last Russian census, which was in 2010, will decline to 107 million by 2050 if current trends don't reverse themselves, right? So this was his clarion call to say, we really need to sort of reinvest in human capital. But what he didn't say, and sort of what I think bears noting, is that this demographic decline isn't uniform. Russia's Muslim minority is faring comparatively well. If you talk to Russian officials in Moscow and elsewhere, they'll tell you that the sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations is that Muslims now are 21 million. 16% of the overall Russian population. But the trend lines are such that by the end of this decade, 1 in 5 Russians, on average, will be Muslim. And as you work further into the future, you're looking at something approaching parity as you get to the bottom of the century. And that in and of itself is not a problem, right? Countries change demographically all the time. America's changing demographically. Where the rub is that this is an underclass because it's denied economic opportunity and political opportunity. It's also one that is discriminated against both officially and unofficially. What ends up happening is a repeat of what you see in Chechnya, what you see in Dagestan, and what you're increasingly seeing in places like Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, where a passive, quiescent, moderate form of Islam, which has traditionally prevailed in Russia, is being at least challenged, if not supplanted, by radical new ideologies from abroad, which are being embraced because of a lack of economic opportunity, because of a lack of political opportunity. And so Chechnya and sort of the Russian struggle against radical Islam has gone on for a long time, but it's gone on mostly sort of away from the public eye because the Kremlin has managed to say, you know what, we have this problem, but it's distant, it's remote, it doesn't sort of have anything to do with you Muscovites or you St. Petersburgers. Now, increasingly, they can't say that because this malaise is spreading. And it's also affecting the single largest minority in the Russian Federation, the one that's actually growing.
And I should just add this, which is in your book. There are those Muslim clerics within the Russian Federation who favor and preach Euro-Islam, a very moderate form. They're under attack, and the point I think that needs stressing is, I'm not using attack in the metaphoric sense here, that there are sermons against them and op-eds.
They're being bombed.
They're being bombed and shot, which is a pretty powerful tool in a polemic.
No, absolutely. And just to give a vignette to the audience so they understand this, if you go to the Russian Republic of Tatarstan and you go to Kazan, which is the capital, a very nice city, a little cold when I went there in December a couple years ago, but there's a street called Gazovaya Ulitsa. It's sort of a very busy through street, and if you stand in the middle of the street and you look straight ahead, you'll see the Islamic University of Tatarstan. This is the Russian government state-approved university. They get subsidies from the Kremlin. Medvedev in 2008 went there and sort of made a very public show of supporting their curriculum. And literally across the street is something called the Enilar Mosque. It's a Wahhabi mosque by sort of any Russian government interpretation. It was funded by the Saudis, funded by the Pakistanis, and it's really emblematic of this sort of tug and pull that's taking place in a lot of Russia's regions now between the traditional moderate form of Islam and something new, something more radical, something more insurgent that's beginning to take hold.
And let me just, before I go back to that, let me just ask you one more question about that mosque and the Wahhabi influence. In past years, we know the Wahhabi influence has essentially planted the seeds of bin Ladenism, because if you're preaching in, as Wahhabis often do, that infidels are vermin, somebody's going to come along and say, so let's solve the problem of the infestation. Is it still, or has there been any moderation? I mean, the Saudis are, theoretically, since 9/11, the Saudis got a wake-up call and have changed their behavior, or have they not, as far as you know, in a case like this? Is the dawah, the preaching, the missionary work, still as likely to incite radicalization?
You know what, it's hard to tell because for obvious reasons it's not transparent. What is clear, sort of when you go to these places, as I've done, to Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, is that there is a class of state-supported, state-funded clerics, right, sort of members of the Russian sort of muftiyat, who are increasingly uncertain about what to do about these insurgents, who don't organize the way the Russian state organizes, who put together camp retreats, who put together educational seminars that take place in private homes and things like that. This is happening, I think, sort of less on a state level, but certainly more on a grassroots level. And precisely in places like Kazan, that's what's most worrying. You can fight it if it's localized in a mosque. You can fight it if it's localized in one preacher. It's very hard to fight when it's beginning to be spread by the grassroots.
If you want to comment on that, you're welcome to, but if not, I'm going to ask you, I'll go on to another question.
Well, one comment is obviously, this is a fascinating vignette, and of course it's, what was that, a year and a half ago, that very close to that place, there was an assassination attempt, and a successful attempt to kill the leading Muslim scholar, and the assassination attempt was, of course, on the Grand Mufti. And afterwards, at least 4 cars with black Al-Qaeda banners paraded in central Kazan. scared the hell out of the Russian and the Tatar officials. And then, of course, a year ago, or it may have been even this early winter, where already 80 miles from Moscow in Orekhozuyma, there was the security forces surrounded a house with where they claimed were the terrorists. The terrorists were killed. But what's interesting is that they were not Chechens; they were Bashkirs. And that, of course, is, I can't stress, I can only add to what Ilan and you said, that if Tatarstan began, which traditionally has been, very secular, very progressive as far as, and starting, by the way, before the Russian Revolution. That's where the so-called Enlightenment started. Tatarstan, yeah. Muslim Enlightenment. If that begins to radicalize, Chechnya would look like a children's picnic.
Why? Why are the Tatars?
Well, first of all, there are 9.5 million of them. In the Soviet days, and I have to check it, Tatars were the third largest ethnic group in Moscow.
So they still may be one of the largest.
No, they're undoubtedly. The only, I mean, I don't want to belabor this because the Tatars who live in Moscow, and certainly the ones who live there for generations, are likely to be least susceptible. On the other hand, we know from the same 9/11 terrorists that it's not, contrary to the quasi-Marxist mythology, it's not the downtrodden and the poor and the hungry that lead the fight. It's the privileged, it's the middle class. And of course, 9 out of those 11 hijackers came from upper middle class of Saudi Arabia.
Yes. All right, now this is a bit of a tricky question, which either of you can take. The threat in Russia of Islamic radicalization is among Sunnis. So there would be theoretically a reason for Putin to reach out to the moderate, more secular Sunnis in the Russian Federation and neighboring. It cannot endear Putin to them that he is working hand in glove with the Shia jihadis who rule Iran and with the Alawites in Syria. Doesn't that create a tension?
Well, I asked this question. I was in Moscow in March, and I asked this question. I got lots of dirty looks because, it was very inopportune. But the answer that I got was actually very telling. A lot of Russian officials that you talk to, they tend to think about the Middle East in particular in two terms. One is mercantile, in the sense that the Middle East is an arms market. The Middle East is, an area of traditional influence, traditional client states, and they want to rebuild relationships. Which goes. Syria is a great example of this, right? The Syrian debt to Russia is enormous. And the second is and sort of by doing so, control what they call control through investments, right? So essentially to try to shape regional politics. The second is that the Russians are petrified that the currents of what's happened in the Middle East and North Africa over the last 2.5 years are going to spill over into the Russian Federation, right? A decade ago, we saw the color revolutions in the post-Soviet space. Now we're seeing the fruits of the Arab Spring. They're worried about sort of this type of radical change. And so, the best defense is a good offense. They're sort of going abroad. But the potential for blowback on this is enormous. A great example is back in March, Yusuf Qaradawi, who is the spiritual head of the Muslim Brotherhood, actually made a public statement in which he said that Russia should now be considered an enemy of Islam because of the support that it's giving to the Assad regime against Syria's own Sunni opposition. That obviously can't bode well for the 21 million and rising, mostly Sunni Muslims who are sort of trying to find their position within the Russian state. When you have voices like that saying things like that from abroad, they are very likely to internalize that message and begin to view the Russian state as not a faithful steward of their religious message as well as their social message.
Okay, there's one more question on this track, and then I'll go to a different track, and that is, this is a kind of famous story. It was told around town by Jose Maria Aznar quietly at one point, and then he went saying, "Don't tell this in public," and then he did. And that is that he was with Putin at his dacha, and Jose Maria Aznar, being the former Prime Minister of Spain, said to Putin, hey, Vladdy, listen, you cannot want Iran to have nuclear weapons. They're on your border. They're a rogue state. They're untrustworthy. I mean, you can't really want that. And essentially, Putin said, I don't. I said, well, then why are you giving them nuclear reactors? He said, because, 3 minutes before they get nuclear weapons, the Israelis are going to take it away from them. So I'm not really too concerned. And I think the implication was, we'll sell it to them again, and we can have it. This will be fun. Is it your sense that is his view of the nuclear weapons, of the possibility of the Iranian rulers, the most important sponsors of terrorism in the world today, human rights violators egregiously at home, inciting genocide, getting nuclear weapons, that he just thinks, I don't have to worry about it, the Israelis will?
Well, Putin is increasingly a risk taker domestically, but it's one of those cases where, as the adage puts it, between conspiracy and ignorance, generally it's the ignorance that wins. Domestically, he is increasingly, as they say, out of it, which is not surprising after 12 years of single image. That's not different from any authoritarian, and we could talk about this because he is taking the country into a fairly obvious dead end, and I think Ilan's thesis is absolutely correct. And 2018 is when I think things will start going. That's when Putin is going to run for the fourth term against the current wishes of 60% of Russians. So you can imagine, after the recession, after everything that's happening, I'm still going to rule you. I think things will get very merry at that time. Now, in terms of Iran, going back, I think Putin's been, I've talked about the Putin doctrine. And without going into these details, you could read about this in Foreign Affairs. But the three goals of traditional Russian foreign policy, which Putin inherited and developed, Russia as a nuclear superpower, Russia as a great world power, and Russia as the cultural, military, and economic hegemon on the territory of the former Soviet Union, this triad is true of any Russian regime prior or after Putin, but Putin added a certain twist to it. And one of the twists is that, actually on each of them, with respect to the great power, great world power, Putin, unlike his predecessor, defined it as an increasing opposition to the United States. That is how you affirm, and again, it goes back to the Soviet Union, this is how you affirm that you're a great power in the world. And in the case of Iran, I think the two components of the Putin doctrine, I think, clashed. You're absolutely right. He wants to be, and this is an imperative, you have to be, you have to have certainly a military hegemony on the territory of the former Soviet Union or next to it. But then on the other hand, if you define great powership as an opposition to the United States, Iran becomes an interesting case. You don't want it to have a bomb because you don't want anybody in your neighborhood to be stronger than you, or at least threaten you in any way. On the other hand, what do you do with opposing the United States? Which, by the way, is increasingly important to Putin domestically, and that's a separate issue. When you're declining economically, every authoritarian reaches for anti-Americanism, and Putin has a very rich background of 70 years of the Soviet Union to work with. In any case, when this happened, that's why the policy is a bit incoherent. Remember, under Medvedev, they signed on a resolution in 2010 that prevented or banned sales of certain equipment. And under that resolution, September 2010, Medvedev did a fairly courageous thing for which I think he's still paying, and that is he, in fact, banned the sale, canceled, not just banned, but canceled the sale of S-300, one of the most advanced surface-to-air missile batteries that Russia has, which, by the way, Putin now threatens
to sell them
to Iran. Along with the second reactor to Bashar.
Right.
So the tension between the two parts of the Putin doctrine, I think, accounts for certain incoherence. But I think generally Putin now is tending towards that view that you expressed. It is better to oppose the United States on Iran and take some risk of Iran actually coming close, but never really getting the bomb, because somebody else will take care of it, rather than be neutral or go along with the United States. There's a whole issue now of what might be called a conservative or reactionary cultural wave that started with Putin's re-election in March 2012, which is a very interesting phenomenon that just bothers me a great deal. Anti-Americanism and this confrontation with the United States on the international scene, largely for domestic political reasons, is one of the aspects of this campaign.
I've got a million questions, but I'm going to also take your questions. So as I ask questions and they're answering, you just signal me. I'll have somebody come over with a microphone. Let me just follow up on this, and then I'll go to you. And the State Department and the administration's view of Russia. Just give us a little comment on that. Obviously, it started out with the idea of reset, with the idea that there was a problem with our relations with Russia that didn't need to exist. It was a misunderstanding. Besides, it had to do with the U.S. treating Russia badly. This could be fixed. I also remember talking 2 years ago to State Department people at very high levels about Syria, saying all we really need to do with Syria is get Russia on board with us about how to facilitate change in a way that's consistent with their interests. They made it sound like this was not a tremendously difficult thing to do, that Russia wanted to work with us on this. Increasingly, not everyone's going to agree with this, but increasingly it seems to me that reset has totally failed. Very, very smart people like Ambassador Michael McFaul was very much in favor of it, and you wonder how he didn't steer. And what's more, that on Syria and almost everything else, Putin does indeed want to undermine the U.S., even while he is, in a certain sense, getting Obama out of a dilemma, but by creating a larger one for him longer term. Right.
Well, this is interesting. Let me navigate this very carefully, because I know there's friends of mine from the State Department that do Russia in the audience, so I'm going to try not to elevate their blood pressure unduly. I would point. I think it's patently clear that the reset, at least as envisioned by the White House, is a little bit close to dead on arrival. And I think sort of the writing was on the wall at that fateful March summit between Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary of State Clinton, when the reset button actually didn't say reset. It said over. Перезагрузка, not a perfect translation. Перезагрузка is sort of reboot. Перегрузка, which the button actually said, is overload.
Overcharge.
Which is right. Which is, I think, a really good sort of theme to think about when you think about the reset. I mean, the Russians have been eating our lunch sort of ever since. But I think it's clear that we're at this sort of inflection point, or at least we were before the last couple of weeks, when you had Putin play peacemaker and provide the Syria deal, where people were seriously thinking about what comes next. If the reset doesn't work, and Leon wrote about this sort of in Foreign Affairs, if the reset doesn't work, what comes next? Is it reset 2.0? Is it a strategic pause? Is it something else entirely? We don't know. What I would suggest, and just sort of from my looking at this issue, is that there are these long-term trend lines that you see within Russia. They're not immediately apparent, but they're already beginning to exert pressure upon the Russian state in sort of all sorts of really interesting ways. For example, Russia has had an Asia pivot before we did. Russia was, a third of Russian territory geographically sits in Asia, and so they've talked a lot about, sort of reorienting their economy, particularly since Europe hasn't been particularly friendly over the last few years, reorienting their economy towards Asia, beginning to engage more. But the Russian Far East, which is the sort of the energy breadbasket of Russia, Western Siberia and the Far East, is increasingly less and less Russian. And this doesn't mean, by the way, that the Russians and the Chinese are going to go to war. I mean, the population density in the republics of the Russian Far East is less than that of Wyoming. It's something like 6 Russians per square mile. So if the People's Liberation Army marched across the border, they wouldn't find any Russians to fight. It's not. Tom Clancy wasn't entirely correct in The Bear and the Dragon, in other words. I don't think that's exactly what's going to happen. But Russia will begin to behave differently, or at least the current bad impulses on the part of the Kremlin are going to be reinforced. Give you an example, right? If you have staked your energy future on a pivot to Asia and becoming a major supplier of natural gas and oil to the countries of the Asia Pacific, and yet you can't control the workforce and you can't control the territory, you're going to go west, young man. You're going to go, and that's going to be increased pressure on former holdings of Russia in the form of the Soviet Union. It's going to be increased pressure on Ukraine, increased efforts to reunite with Belarus, and increased tensions with the European sphere, including with NATO. And so my point is that as these long-term trend lines begin to kick in earnest, you should think about what that will do for American policy. There's lots of things we can do to ameliorate those trends, or at least sort of blunt their impact upon ourselves and our allies. We may not be able to stop them, but we should certainly be thinking about them as we do the new reset.
All right, a lot of subjects are gone. Let's start. Please introduce yourself on microphone, even if I know you. Peter, we'll start with you, and microphone's coming down right now. You want to ask a question right here? Yeah.
I'd like both Ilan and
Again, just introduce yourself and where you're from.
From the American Foreign Policy Council. Aron and Ilan, what energy resources are the Russians going to develop new resources in the Far East to export, or export what they have elsewhere and build pipelines and so forth, and tankers and so forth? How do you see that playing? Because they've been playing a game with Iran and trying to build a OPEC of natural gas, which fracking threw into over the cliff. One of the reasons that Russia was very unhappy with Bush. How do you see
Go
that
right in the
playing
mic.
out?
I'm not sure people are hearing. Okay, all right. Everyone got the question? Okay, go ahead.
Well, very briefly, until a year ago, the chairman of Gazprom, Miller, used to say fracking is a legend, does not exist. It's a case of, a sort of almost religious attempt to kind of exercise something that is a death knell to Gazprom. And Gazprom, as you know, suffering hugely in Europe already, losing to Statoil of Norway because of the contracts, because it's lumbering, because of the corruption, because of the waste. Now Putin told Gazprom not to raise the utility component of gas. And Gazprom essentially said, "You're bankrupting us." And that is, Russians have the expression "trishkin kaftan," which is a finite set of clothing, which if you cut in one end, then you're short on the other. Gazprom has been a cash cow for the regime. Putin is strangling it. And of course, it's being clobbered by various things, fracking among them. So the situation with Gazprom is very sad for Gazprom. It certainly does not have money to invest. And let me just very briefly address that issue.
Money for the regime.
And for the regime, well, of course, somebody said, I forgot, one of those very smart Russian commentators said that the Putin regime has three pillars: security service, FSB, the control of television, and then gas and oil. That's absolutely correct. One of them goes, the whole edifice collapses. What it boils down to is the fact that, as I think it was Dan Yergin who said, it's not that Russia is running out of oil, it's running out of cheap oil. West Siberia, the so-called brownfields, are being squeezed, and you have to go north and east. You have to go to Chukotka, you have to go to the various Arctic seas, and the investment there runs into not just billions, tens of billions of dollars. And the question is, who will go? One of the indicator was of a cooling off of the Western investors was, of course, the cancellation of the Stockman, supposed to be Stockman, huge development offshore. By the way, it's all offshore. So add to this, to the temperatures, also the fact that it's all offshore. So Stockman essentially was canceled. You remember that Putin actually invited CEOs of those companies. He showed them off and told them how good things were going to be. It is a symptom of a general problem at which I hinted and which Ilan explores in his book, which is that to grow, there's no other way for Russia not just to grow, but not to slide into recession, other than stimulating investment. But stimulating investment requires deep institutional reforms, which in turn will kill the regime. So it is increasingly this catch-22 and a dead end. And I think what you're talking about, the desperate attempts to first interest China, then Iran, then sort of thresh about trying to get somebody to invest, is looking more and more pathetic.
Question over here. Go ahead and take the microphone and introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Okay. My name is Pablo Rodas from the Inter-American Development Bank. I have three quick questions. One, Russia in the last 3 or 4 centuries has always been considered an expansionist country in the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and the Pacific. It means that because the population is going to reduce, this is going to change. I mean, the borders are going to be like now, or even shrink in Russia because of these nationalities. This is one question. The second, about the issue of gas and oil. In economic literature, there is the talk about natural resource course, that countries that have these resources, then the institutions become very weak, corruption, and they don't produce anything else. Is Russia in this stage? I mean, is destiny to have the natural resource course? And the last one is about democracy in Russia, and Russia really hasn't had an experience of real democracy on the Western style, more or less like China, but at least China had, after or before the Japanese invasion, had some period of democracy. It means that this historical background, this burden of history, is so deep that makes it very complicated for Russia to advance on the democracy side.
Good questions. You want to start?
Let me tackle a couple. I'll punt the democracy question mercilessly. But on the expansionism, I make the point in the book, look, nothing is certain, right, in the future, except I think you can make some reasonable assumptions about how Russia is going to behave based upon history, based upon its foreign policy and its imperial and now neo-imperial impulses. So I would suggest the following, that there are 2 trends that suggest strongly that Russia's territorial boundaries are going to shift and Russia's going to move west. And I don't mean ideologically, I mean territorially. Because first of all, Russia's going to begin to lose influence, if not actual territory, in the Far East. Right? I have a friend who says that Chinese suzerainty in the Far East is going to come much sooner than Chinese sovereignty. I think that's exactly right. I think the way the workforce and the way the economic investment climate is changing in the Far East, it suggests that the future is increasingly Chinese, it's not Russian. And if you're Russia, and if you are a one-trick pony in terms of international economic might, right, natural gas and oil, you're going to be looking elsewhere. Somehow you have to widen the pie. Russia's looking in 2 primary directions. One is north, right, to the Arctic, right? The Russians have a much more serious Arctic strategy than we do. For those of you who are long-term scholars of Soviet scholars, Sovietologists, you know that the Russian government really means something when they put it in a legal document, right? They really mean it. So the fact that the Russian government came out in 2009 and translated into English in 2010 the national strategy for securing the Arctic into the future, and it talks about stationing military garrisons in the Arctic, reconfiguring the way their North Fleet functions, sort of all that stuff, should be a suggestion that the Russians are they're putting real policy thought behind the fact that the Arctic is an energy-rich area and climate change is beginning to make it more and more accessible. The second is the former holdings of the Soviet Union, right? There's a very strong imperial impulse in Russia that transcends political divides. That's why you hear Russian conservatives and Russian liberals talk about the need to reclaim lost lands. Right? The most famous of them, of course, was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who talked on the floor of the Russian Duma about Russia being a torn state and how that travesty needs to be reconstituted. And so, as you see Russia begin to lose territory to China and begin to lose population in terms of demographic decline, the impulse for Russia to begin to look abroad, both for economic terms, but also for ideological terms and population terms, becomes almost overwhelming. The logical end result of that is growing friction on the periphery with Europe, and growing tensions with countries that seem to have other ideas, like, for example, Ukraine, like Kazakhstan. And so, the future of Russia, as it begins to decline, is not one of pacific relations with its neighbors. It's one of increasing tensions with its neighbors, just by dint of history.
Let me just throw this into the mix in this question. So if Russia is looking west a bit, most obvious are the Slavic countries that were part of the Soviet Union, and in a way were part of Russia. Belarus is, after all, one can make the case it's part of historical Russia. Ukraine, one can make this, the word Ukraine means frontier. One can make the case. Meanwhile, and I just saw this, I don't know if you did, the Chinese have bought farmland in the Ukraine,
5% of
the
Ukraine.
size of Belgium.
Right.
This is to feed the Chinese, assuming with the land being worked by Ukrainian peasants overseen by Chinese managers. This is, I wonder if this doesn't disturb a lot of people in the Ukraine, but I also wonder if it doesn't disturb a lot of people in Russia to see what could be considered a very interesting 21st century form of colonialism. You don't need to conquer the land, you just buy it. And you buy it on their border.
Doing it all over the world.
And they're doing it all over the world, but in this, and I think that's a whole another session we're having. But in this case, they're doing it in the Ukraine, buying land the size of Belgium for their own, and making it essentially a suburb of China and taking it over. If the Russians have any sense of this is part of the Russian heritage, part of the Slavic heritage, they've got to be pretty disturbed by that, no?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. All right, we'll go to another question right back there.
I don't think we answered.
I'm sorry.
all
You want to
the
answer?
questions.
Go ahead.
No, Ilan. Are you continuing?
I'm done.
Well, very briefly
I
on
vented my spleen.
On petrostate, you're absolutely right. Russia is beginning to develop all the charms of a petrostate. The ruble is appreciating, despite the fact that the central bank continues to buy dollars at a huge amount. Imports, therefore, are becoming more affordable. Exports, except for oil and gas, are more expensive, and therefore domestic industries, that's another, other than oil and gas, are in huge decline. I wrote a paper 3 or 4 years ago to show how Russia is increasingly dependent on basic food staples, on the import. I mean, this is one of the most
Import from where?
Western Europe, China, Central Asia, Turkey.
Not from Ukraine.
Well, Ukraine. Well, the chocolate is the key issue with Ukraine. Putin banned chocolate, but actually more than that, because he wants them to join the customs union versus a roadmap for European Union, which is another interesting issue. I think after a while, even Yanukovych will decide to go European way, because, against all his better instincts, because simply, as somebody correctly pointed out to me, there'll be blood on the streets of Kiev, and Ukraine will lose Western Ukraine if they join the customs union. Lose in the sense of civil disturbance and perhaps even violence, because Western Ukrainians will see it as rejoining the Soviet Union, as something that, given their history, they will resist at all costs. Going back to the petrostate, corruption, elite that very rich and sends children to Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard, whereas the quality of education and healthcare in the country is rapidly going down. Huge spending on defense. So all the features, absolutely. Russia is acquiring all those hardened features of a petrostate, and of course, that is very dangerous. On the democracy, as Cliff pointed out, if biology is not destiny, neither is history. I think countries do change, and I don't know if we'll get around to it, but there have been some very interesting developments starting December, winter of 2011, 2012. The protesters, who, despite the cliches of they're only a minority and they all but disappeared, and we could get into this, are a very, very interesting sign, because this is the emergence of the post-Soviet middle class, which in its demands, its moral imperatives, is very similar to the third wave of democratization in Southern Europe in the 70s, the Asian tigers in the 80s, Mexico in the 1990s. So they will not, let me assure you, they will not disappear. The mayoral elections in Yekaterinburg, the fourth largest city, Moscow, and Petrozavodsk have shown that if you give them a minimally free and fair election, the enthusiasm for the opposition candidates is by far greater than for the regime. So you have to keep that in mind. I think you're absolutely right. Until about this time, there really has not been a generation of Russians who grew up in a relatively, I should say, in a mildly authoritarian country, as opposed to traditional authoritarian, as opposed to totalitarian country. But they did grow up, and if you look at their demands, at their slogans, they're virtually their lifestyles, their aspirations, and paraphernalia of their life. Middle class and upper middle class in 10 of Russia's largest cities is becoming indistinguishable from that of Western Europe. Yet they, of course, they're mentally there, but of course they're in Russia. That is increasingly going backwards. This is a huge conflict. It is going to get only sharper, and this is something to watch very carefully.
Very interesting. Okay, the question,
Hi,
please.
Wayne Merrick, also the American Foreign Policy Council, and I had the advantage of having read the book before it came out. I would note that the book's very heavily footnoted, but I think you could have written exactly the same book and have cited really only public statements of President Putin and of the Russian government. I mean, they've been extremely candid about their own problems. The question is, what happens and what do you do about it? I mean, I think the book is a little missold on the cover, because you don't actually say that these things are irrevocable. You actually posit that Herb Stein was right, that unsustainable processes aren't sustained. Something happens, things change. And that's what I'd like to ask you to talk about, because as you know, I was the head of political reporting in Moscow during the breakup of the Soviet Union, so I've seen Russia go through a massive transformation close up. I think it's not that far away from that kind of event. Again, I think it would be a rather different one. I actually happen to think that we're likely to look back on Mr. Putin with some nostalgia, because what comes after could be decidedly worse. But one of the things I think you really ought to talk about here is the things that you discuss in the book, is your anticipation of what you think will change and what will come out of it.
Well, thank you, Wayne. And by the way, that was not a softball question, for those of you that have sort of taken a look at the book. But I think what's interesting is, and you sort of hit the nail on the head, Bill Bennett once told me that the mark of a true conservative is that no matter how bad things are, you can always expect that they would get worse, right? And I think that's true sort of when you think about Russia, that the type of processes that you're seeing. And I take, by the way, I take only limited responsibility for the title and the cover, because it's, after all, an explosion, not an implosion, although I don't know how to illustrate an implosion. And also, the marketing department told me to mind my own business. So the book is about the end of the Russian state, as Leon talked about sort of, at the beginning. What you're seeing, Russia has been around for centuries, and Russia will be around for centuries. But the Russia that we know now is becoming an endangered species because of the trend that I talked about, the sort of the depopulation, the radicalization of a growing minority, and sort of this strategic contest that's unfolding with China. If you look into the future, you can of course anticipate that the Russian state will behave differently, potentially, than it is today. But if you plot out the current trend lines, the future doesn't look so good. Why? Because the Russian government, at least up until now, has not made serious investments in what is really the lifeblood of vibrant societies today, right? In healthcare, education, infrastructure. The World Health Organization estimates that that expenditures on healthcare, government expenditures on healthcare, have remained constant as a percentage of GDP since the mid-1990s, right? There's no peace dividend here, right? We had a peace dividend after the Cold War. They didn't. You have a rather ambitious plan for what's amorphously called modernization that's been put forward by the Kremlin over the last year, but everybody I've talked to in Moscow has no anticipation that this is actually going to be modernization on anything that's going to improve the quality of life of, or the longevity of life of ordinary Russians, right? There's a lot of discussion of, for example, military modernization. not so much on energy infrastructure, not so much on roads and things like that. And the trend line that sort of I think occupies me the most, because I spend a lot of time looking at ideologies, particularly in the Middle East and sort of radical Islam, is the fact that what you saw in Boston in April with the Tsarnaev brothers, who allegedly, right, well, the trial hasn't happened yet, right, allegedly carried out the Boston bombing, was in many ways, not totally, but in many ways an echo of what's happening in Russia, right? They were radicalized as a result of their local political grievances. They were, after all, of Chechen origin, and they had gone there and gone to Dagestan to train and to be further radicalized. And I think that's a really useful sort of device to think about Russia into the future, because what the Kremlin, there's that old saw that says that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The Russian anti-radicalism campaign in the Caucasus has been very brutal and very remote, and to that extent very successful, because the Russians have been able to put it mostly sort of out of mind, right? It's over there, but it's increasingly not over there. It's in the Russian heartland. And how the Russian government responds to it, and whether, frankly, if it's able to respond to it, I think is going to determine a whole bunch of things. But you can anticipate, if you like Chechnya, you're going to love what comes next in places like Tatarstan.
We have less than 10 minutes. I want to make sure we get some clarity on this point. You've been talking about the dissolution of the Russian state. I infer from your book that we're also talking about the destruction of the Russian nation. If ethnic Russians become a minority within Russia, over time you're talking about the failure not just of a state but of a nation. Or do you not interpret that way? And I want both of you to answer this.
I think it's a good question. I think it's an open question, because you're purely being speculative if you sort of look out at 2080 and beyond. But I think the trend lines are such, both in terms of demographic decline and also in terms of outmigration. Right? Russia is having an outmigration of ethnic Russians that rivals in size and scope the outmigration that preceded the creation of the Soviet Union. I mean, this is an enormous.
And some of the best minds, presumably,
Absolutely.
because they're being.
And by the way, and when they're invited back to invest in high technology hubs outside of Moscow, their answer isn't just no, it's hell no, we're not going to come, because they know that their intellectual property is sacrosanct. They know that the Russian government is going to play fast and loose with their with their products. And so as a result, what you're having is this sort of brain drain that you talked about at the beginning, and the aggregate result is that what you have left at the end is a population that is more negative on the future of Russia than very many generations that have come before, and increasingly are eyeing the exits. This is a great statistic done by a Russian national news agency last year, right? RIA Novosti is official. They estimated that, according to the poll of something like 1,000 respondents in Moscow and St. Petersburg, 40% of respondents between the ages of 18 and 40 are thinking actively about leaving the country. That's an enormous indictment of the Russian state as it currently stands.
And again, I want to talk about the Russian nation as well, because it's one thing for regime change, a state to fall, a different structure. That's happens all the time. We're talking, but I'm suggesting that there's at least a danger of something much more earth-shattering.
Yeah, well, there is. I mean, obviously, Russia is not alone. The same trends are occurring in a lot of post-Soviet states, and of course in Europe.
Yes.
In fact, the U.S. is probably the only industrial democracy which is actually across ethnic boundaries. And this is Putin doesn't like when we talk about American exclusivity, but with all
exceptionalism,
right? With all due respect, I think there is something
dangerous.
There is a certain amount of optimism here that leads to at least an equilibrium rather than decline of the population. But let me just give a ray of hope here. I think, of course, the Russian population will decline as the Italian population or Spanish population and so on. The rest, whether it will cross, the line from a simple decline in the population, of nation side that Ilan is talking about, depends on what kind of political regime it will have. Clearly, if the regime changes in the direction that most of those 40% would like, they don't. I mean, Ilan's parents know, and I know. I mean, leaving your country is not that pleasant. There are all kinds of things that aren't pleasant about it. But so for the most part, those people will stay. They're the best brains. They're young. the chances are they'll reproduce. And so the question is, apart from the issues of the Far East, which is a very separate issue, and yes, I was in Vladivostok 2 years ago. There was very little affinity for Moscow because, as I'm sure Ilan heard the same thing. The mantra is, well, what does it do for us?
And this is among ethnic Russians?
Oh yeah, absolutely, of course. So they're much closer economically, socially now even to China and Japan. But the point is that is a separate issue. Whether it will cross that red line, I think in many respects depends on the regime. And one last thing, let me address a very interesting point that was asked, or about which you asked, and that is what comes after Putin. That issue, remember, I believe I started by saying that there's this reactionary, cultural, social, political campaign that accompanies direct repression. And that worries me more than the direct repression. And the reason for that is because this regime, suicidally, I think, is stigmatizing, scaring, and marginalizing precisely. I did a study which we published. I traveled through the Soviet Russia from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad across the entire country, talking to the non-political NGOs. These are the people who are Russia's best hope. They're responsible, they're prone to compromise, they're reasonable, they're advocating personal responsibility. In other words, if regime begins to falter and wants some sort of soft landing, these are the people that could save its neck and other parts. But that is precisely the people that are now being repressed, scared, marginalized, stigmatized with the foreign agent law and whatnot, and forced to leave the country. And I'm about to finish. So what we might have is the Tahrir Square on Red Square, because 6 more years of this, and these truly progressive, truly modernizing, completely prone to compromise, very pragmatic forces are going to fall victim to inevitable. What's occurring in Russia today is polarization, radicalization, further split between what's known as Russia 1 and Russia 2. And I think we're looking at possibly very unpleasant surprises by 2018, where I think push will come to shove.
Right, and I'll just add one point, because I think you
Let me ask you to sum up in this last...
Sum up?
Oh, yeah. Well, or add any points that you think have been missed.
Well, I think this is a good one, which is that sort of there's a truism of warfare that your adversary also gets a vote. So, the key word that I took away from what Leon said was marginalization, because it's not just that the Russian state, as constructed by Vladimir Putin, is rotten to the core. It is that it is actively working to preserve itself. And so if you've seen what's happened over the last 2 years, you know that Putin's party, Putin's what they call political faction, right, United Russia, is increasingly unpopular because of corruption, sort of widespread corruption, because of sort of, large public flameouts by party officials, and so Putin, never to be outdone, has actually widened the discussion, and he's built something called the Российский национальный фронт, right, the Народный front, the Russian National Front, which is an umbrella of something like 250 organizations and political NGOs and political parties, which are intended to provide quote-unquote policy ideas for United Russia. This is essentially a political vehicle to rehabilitate United Russia, to change the conversation away from the corruption that is endemic to Putin's state to something larger. But the aggregate result of that is those people that Leon talked to are pushed further and further to the margins of the Russian political spectrum, right? Because they're being co-opted. The groups that are sort of, they're either being co-opted or they're being marginalized. And there's that old saying that when evolution becomes impossible, revolution becomes inevitable, right? And so I think that's a very good point. That as you walk into the future, we're not talking about political stability. We're talking about greater instability.
This can almost be a yes or no question, but you got to go a little longer than that, but not too much. Does Putin have a vision for post-Putin Russia?
No, it does not exist for him.
That's right. Absolutely not.
He'll be there forever. He in Russia,
He's vigorous.
He's vigorous, and remember, de Gaulle, France et moi, Russia это я. And after 12 years in power, and add to the 6 more years by 2018, when Putin will have been in power for as long as Brezhnev, and attempting 6 more years to be in power as long as Stalin, 26 years. Everything is irrelevant at that point. He's turning into Mubarak, which is why the Tahrir Square on the Red Square is becoming a real possibility.
I think that's exactly right. And if you talk to officials in the Kremlin, you're struck by the fact that they always talk about tactics. It's not long-term strategy. The lack of investment in infrastructure, the lack of a long-term strategic vision for Russian national greatness is striking. They're in it for the here and now. And Putin, unless he catches a cold because he wrestles tigers shirtless, is going to be around for a while. So, there's no need to think about what comes after because he's going to be around forever.
Well, on that interesting point of concurrence, I found this a very edifying conversation. I hope you did as well. Let me ask you to thank our panelists.